Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's session of Turn on Federalism. My name is Soren Kyle. I am the academic director of the website 50 Shades of Federalism, and we are co-organizing today's event together with the Hans Seidel Foundation. Please allow me to say a few words about this project at the beginning before I introduce and hand over to today's speakers. The Hans Seidel Foundation is a German political foundation entrusted with a mandate by the German Parliament. Its core mandate is to promote and support democracy and the rule of law within Germany, but also worldwide in over 100 projects in more than 60 partner countries. 50 Shades of Federalism is a website project which was established in 2017. It publishes short research papers on the topics of federalism, decentralization, and conflict analysis. The online series Turn on Federalism, of which today's event is part of, is a collaboration between the two organizations, and the idea is to lift the debate on federalism to a global level. We would like to engage with experts, with politicians, with civil society activists around the world to discuss federalism and the different shades and country-based evolutions of federalism and decentralization in the world. Today, we're going to talk about the oldest federation in the world, the United States of America. In many parts of the world, the US is still seen as the shining example of a federal country based on a separation of powers and a functional, clear distribution of competences between the federal and the state level. Yet, so the argument that Professor Sonnicksen will present, in recent years, we've seen increased polarization and frictions in the American system. So the question we will look at today is, what is the future of US democracy, especially now with a new president in power, but continued pressure on the system, probably most visible through the ongoing coronavirus crisis. Before I hand over to Professor Sonnicksen, please allow me to introduce today's speakers. Professor Sonnicksen is currently professor at the University of Darmstadt in Germany. He is an expert on American politics, and we are very glad that he has agreed to join us today. Today's session of Turn on Federalism is the first session where we will have two speakers. So I'm also very glad to welcome Representative Sage Dickson. Representative Dickson is an Idaho State representative, and we are very glad that he has agreed to join us today for the discussions on the future of American federalism. As always, please remember to use the Q&A box for any questions. We will pass these questions on to our speakers. And for those of you who want to follow today's event in Myanmar language, please use the language button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select Myanmar/Burmese language. I hope you will enjoy today's event, and without any further delay, please allow me to hand over to Professor Sonnicksen. Thank you very much.
So, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everybody, depending on where you're watching. How exciting to be a part of this unique event. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've watched a number of these discussions by Turn on Federalism. Thank you to the Hans Seidel Foundation and 50 Shades of Federalism, led by Sören Kyle, for putting this together. And such an honor to take part in this, and also a pleasure to be in this first type of event where there's two speakers. And I think with Representative Sage Dickson, also an excellent combination to have someone from the more academic side who thinks to be able to present something about how politics works, and then we have somebody who's the real expert to share the virtual stage today. So once again, thank you very much. I'm going to switch now to share my screen, so you will see my PowerPoint. One moment, please. Okay. So in the introduction, Sören Kyle already pointed to the most important points that we would like to, I believe, talk about today, where federal democracy, the US federal democracy is today and where it might be going. With no false modesty, I can say I have nothing really new to present, not information-wise. And I think how politics have developed in the US are quite well known, and especially the turbulences of the past few years. Nevertheless, I do hope that I can provide a fresh or hopefully informative perspective of how to make sense of where things have developed to, and maybe a little bit, as best as we can, sort of gauge or assess where things could be going. To provide you a bit of an overview in a short amount of time, and I will do my best to be quick. To start out, let's just say common knowledge, and I will underline that as well, that the US polity, so its political system in general, both in federalism and democracy, is quite polarized. But I would add to that also fragmented, and I will explain as we go why the addition of fragmented is important. So that's enough for essentially the introduction from my part. What comes next? In the second step, I would like to go very briefly into a more theoretical concept background, building on the work of Arthur Bentz. For those who are interested, you can read, I've quoted a reference to paper here, also in the 50 Shades of Federalism series. And just very briefly, a bit about, and I'll simplify it, how to understand and assess how federalism and democracy work, what are various types of combinations of federalism and democracy in one political system, and how do we gauge the US already as a federal democracy, that then in the third step going forward. So what is the predisposition, the sort of overall character, how federal democracy has developed in the US, and a fourth step, very briefly, how do we assess or characterize recent developments, and finally, I provide a conclusion, which, to give away a little bit where things are going, is an exercise in expectation management. So to switch to the theoretical background, there's so much we can talk about federalism and democracy in general, how we define them, and so on and so forth. To make it brief and not too theoretical, it's important to underline, and again, I point that I'm building on the work of Arthur Bentz, who has worked a concept of federalism democracy, is to underline that we have two distinct, very different dimensions of government. Now, to focus on the government part, not so much the theories of federalism and democracy, but viewing them as ways of doing government. We can focus on that federalism and government of a democracy are arrangements to divide powers. In federalism, we can say more or less this is among levels of government, whereas in democracy and modern democracies tend to be representative democracies. So how powers are divided among the branches of government, particularly legislatures and executives. So that being said, of course, there are different types we can have, both of federalism and democracy. One way of orienting ourselves is to look at how far do they either separate the powers between levels of government and federalism, or between branches of government and democracy, or are they more inclined to share powers, combine them, emphasize the joint or common exercise of powers, responsibilities, and tasks. We can look at this in both structural, functional, or formal, also formal institutional terms, or rather how the two operate in practice. Are there tendencies towards unilateralism, going it alone? So the separate units do their own thing and leave each other alone. Are they more in competition with each other? Or are they required, even by the Constitution and not just by necessity, to work together? We can say at the bottom line, regardless of what theoretical expectations we have either on federalism or on democracy, when the two are together, you have a series of tensions and even frictions, precisely because they have different ways of working together, follow different rules and different principles. Federalism, let's say, more about regulating relations between the subunits or the national level and the state levels, whether the states are called provinces, cantons, Bundesländer, what have you. And democracy, more about the relationships between the people and the government and the branches of government themselves. And those are not always easy to reconcile with each other. Coupling is the concept, then again, by Arthur Benz, that captures what these interlinkages are in structural terms, but also in practice. What sort of patterns of interactions do we have? And then again, looking at, are they more prone or have a stronger tendency towards separation or cooperation? Are there formal requirements for cooperation, joint tasks, common responsibilities, or does federalism, democracy, respectively, emphasize the separateness of branches and levels of government? And three varieties of a federal democracy would be then, going by this framework, a decoupled, tightly coupled, or intermediary, more loosely coupled systems. From the outset, we could say that the US tends clearly towards a more decoupled type, and I'll speak about that next some more. By comparison, the German Federal Republic would be almost the ideal type of a more tightly coupled system, where levels of government are strongly interwoven or interconnected with each other. So as I already pointed out, that the US is by predisposition in its character, by constitution, clearly almost an ideal type of a rather decoupled federal democracy. In its organization of government, a so-called presidential system of government. Now that doesn't mean that's the same as executive dominance. This term refers to executive and legislative branches are, in comparison to parliamentary systems, more independent of one another. There's no votes of confidence or dissolution of the legislature through the executive. There's fixed terms of office. In practice, the branches have to work with each other to get things done, but they cannot force each other to cooperate with one another. And if they don't get along with each other, executive and Congress, or at state level, governors and the state legislatures, they're forced to live with each other till the next elections, unlike in parliamentary systems. So again, an emphasis on separation of powers, whereas in federalism, the US also here, an almost ideal type, traditionally by constitution, a dual federalism. So strict separation between the levels of government. The US Constitution to this day prescribes almost no compulsory joint tasks other than the presidential election itself, where the states and federal government essentially together elect the president, or and the people, obviously, or changing the Constitution requires approval by the federal and state levels. But that's almost it with regard to compulsory cooperation between federal and state levels. And that has not really changed in over 225 years. But of course, a lot has changed over time. And the strict decoupled nature of the US Constitution, or the polity, already started changing in the 19th century, but these changes accelerate in the 20th century, very much so. Among many things we could point out, I will refer to, with regard to the democratic dimension of government, the presidency, the changes in the presidency and the party system are most notable. And with regard to federalism, the expansion of intergovernmental relations, so interlinkages between states and federal level, and the switch to more cooperative federalism. And with that, we come now to my fourth step. So where has federalism and US federalism democracy developed into? Here I refer to John Kincaid, who also, his contribution in the series of 50 Shades of Federalism, that the US really has 3 shades of federalism: this dual federalism, this more strict separation by constitution, no predisposition. That has not changed. The Constitution of the US has been amended very few times in comparison internationally. But cooperative federalism, more stronger interlinkages, at least in practice, developed already in the 19th century, but intensified very much in the 20th century, where you have the federal government regulating, but also providing funds in a lot of policy areas that are typically responsibilities to this day formally of the states, be it infrastructure, social and welfare policy, education, environmental policy, where the states de facto end up implementing a lot of federal government regulations, but get funded for it. But as the 20th century proceeds, and this is a term coined by John Kincaid, is the coercive federalism, that the federal government expands more and more the regulations and the conditions that it attaches to funding in order for states to receive federal monies. And so they expand even further into regulating into areas that are not formally the competence or responsibility of the federal government. And this is something, regardless of who's in the majority of the US Congress or in the White House, Democrats and Republicans have both tended to follow this pattern. One reason is, of course, I would say, not only would have to do with the presidency itself. The presidency becomes a more popular presidency, certainly in the 20th century, for a lot of reasons: modern media, democratization, and this election of the president that to this day is somewhat indirect through the Electoral College, but de facto becomes a truly felt popular election of a president who has a strong mandate to govern. And so the pressure is high for presidents and their administrations to implement their policies, and they're elected on a national scale. So that's one push factor driving not only a democratic push factor, changing also how federalism operates, this expansion of the federal government, but without changing the Constitution. The two-party system consolidates. The US has always had a two-party dominance, but in the course of the 20th century, it becomes the same two parties, and they orient more towards consolidate also across the polity, so branches and levels of government. So we have a complex situation in US federal democracy to this day, and continuing a quite fragmented system of separation of powers on the one hand, but a development towards quite competitive and even simple majoritarian politics. All branches and all offices in the US are almost all elected through simple majoritarian, first past the post, winner takes it all rules. So you have on the one hand this very hyper majoritarianism in the system at different levels and branches of government, yet combined in a system that diffuses and disperses power at the same time. So at the one hand, very majoritarian, at the same time, very complex division of powers. So simple majorities cannot govern in the US. Let me refer, because time is running, I don't want to take too long, but I think I already pointed about this, how the federal government tries to get into areas that the states classically do, one of those being the presidentialization or the expansion of the presidency of politics, is to do submerged governance, indirect ways of getting their policies through, be it through executive orders, attaching conditions to funding, so not the regular legislative process, and certainly not by changing the Constitution. so that what the federal government is and does can become submerged or invisible to many people. And this brings with it, to switch to Timothy Conlin, one source of delegitimation of governance, federal governance in the US, is that it's difficult for people to trace back where responsibility is, and that combined with the complex division of powers and similar. At the same time, we have this trend of the nationalization of politics that I referred to, combined with the polarization. So the two parties have both nationalized to a strong extent in their orientation, not fully, of course, and I'm sure Representative Dickson can say something about this also as being an expert state level practitioner. But at least judging by party research, this seems to be an overall trend that the two parties have become quite uniform within themselves, much more so than was the case 20, 30 years ago. And at the same time, combined with that, polarized. This polarization is not just then in competition, but also increasingly that the parties and the levels of government refuse to cooperate with one another along party lines. So if the White House is dominated by a Democrat, Republican-led states might try to go their own way or combat federal governance, and vice versa if a Republican is in the White House or the majority in Congress, so that this polarization is not limited at just the branches of government at one level, but seems to permeate or radiate through the levels of government too. So really quick, the bottom line, the Trump presidency, let's say, is more a symptom of these growing trends. There were a lot of turbulences the last 4 years, but I would say the trends that I'm referring to have simply intensified and are not necessarily new, and have intensified in the past, well, 2, 3 decades. Certainly, those who remember the Obama presidency and healthcare reform, for example, and how much contestation took place then along also these polarized lines. So a major dilemma, I would say, going forward in the US federal democracy is that the political divisions and tensions, they exist also in the society among people and within different states, but I think the political system amplifies them, particularly through these simple majoritarian rules. And part of the problem is that the US has inherited a constitution from the 18th century, so a very old constitution. We can celebrate this as a long-living constitution that has survived so long, but because of its difficulties in being amended to modern challenges, the high thresholds to amend the Constitution present the US with serious challenges. It's proved in the turbulences, and some would say some problematic ones the past 4 years with regard to expansion of the presidency, some manipulations, rule of law concerns that occurred under the Trump presidency. But whether it was Trump or other presidents who have also tried to expand executive authority through executive orders, the system remains remarkably resilient against expansions and abuses of power, but at the same time, resistance to adaptations. So with that, going forward with Biden, we need to manage our expectations, not only vis-a-vis Joseph Biden, but also the presidency in general. There are too much expectations placed on the US presidency, which has taken on this through democratic dynamics, all these expectations we have on the new administrations, but the Constitution hasn't changed. The president has really no new powers to do the things that so many people expect presidents to do. So that's one thing. But also with regard to bipartisan cooperation, and to an extent, I would say, and not being political, but we have over the past few years a radicalization that's taken place in part of the Republican Party. The polarization has taken place also in the Democratic Party, which has moved on the whole quite further to the left than was the case also 20, 30 years ago. But the amount of contestation, and we saw this very much in the past elections, spells concerns about how well the Democratic majority in Joseph Biden will be able to work under these conditions. Most visible also with a large share of the Republicans in Congress not even accepting the legitimacy of the president. And the moderates and the Republicans are even being censured by their own party for having criticized for the former President Trump. And so, and I think a lot of the moderates in the Republican Party see this also as a challenge. I would say that was on a political level, that's going to be one of the largest challenges for bipartisanship. But of course, also not to be political in that extent, but I think party research is there, has quite a consensus. So there's a necessity maybe for some institutional reforms that would make governing easy, make clearly spelling out what are the federal government's competences, instead of having to interpret passages from the 18th century, whether the federal government can regulate environment or welfare and so on and so forth. Their newer and younger constitutions have it easier because they were adapted at times when the state or government in general does a lot more than it did 200 some years ago. But it's unlikely for many of the reasons I just mentioned. The Constitution is difficult to change. But we can still be hopeful. We should remain hopeful. And American federal democracy has proved quite adaptable to different changes. And that's one of the strengths of the Constitution without being changed that much. It has adapted over 200 and some years. But we need to keep our hopes up, but not too high, I would say. And that would be my conclusion. Thank you very much. And I would like to hand over to Representative Dickson. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Sonnicksen. I appreciate that wonderful overview. Also appreciate being here with the Hans Seidel Foundation, this opportunity to speak to everybody. It's a great honor to participate in this and to bring the perspective of a state legislator in a small state within America and what I see as some of the difficulties that are entailed in our system of federalism, but also some of the things that I appreciate about it, and understanding that difficulty is part of our process and what we're doing. I think that's maybe what I'll start with, is that I think the intent was for our process to be a little difficult. I think our founders were very astute and had great prudence and foresight, great knowledge of what history had shown them at that point, of what failed systems of government were, and coming out of the monarchical parliamentary system, and what they wanted to do in an overarching way to protect individual rights and specifically individual states after when the Constitution was formed in its new form from the Articles of Confederation. That's what I was trying to remember, and making those improvements on a very weak federal government to a federal government that was a bit stronger, but still allowed for individualities within the states and addressing those, and not allowing larger populations to suppress smaller populations, but at the same time not having the larger states be held captive by the smaller ones. And the way we've structured things with our horizontal and vertical system of federalism, I think, has worked out very well until some of the changes occurred that Professor Sonnicksen had spoke of in the early 20th century, when we started to engage things a little bit more, and constitutional changes came in that took some power away from states, and we've continued in that progression. I appreciate what the professor had in his three shades there, because these are things that I was dwelling on and what I would speak of, and he, I don't know if intentionally, I'm sure not intentionally, but anticipated a lot of the things I wanted to speak of, so that makes it a little easier. I can refer to his work a little bit, but that progression from dual federalism all the way up to coercive federalism. And as a state representative, dealing with both in-state issues, but then our relationship with the federal government, that progression has been really pronounced. We try and do things according to the Idaho way, is what we would call it, what is good for the people of Idaho and our state, as other states do, and what is good for their states. But through that, what was cooperative and now has become coercive, it becomes very difficult in that relationship, meaning that there are now many programs that we have to enforce that come from the federal government. And along with those programs are tied dollars that states have become very dependent upon. And that reduces, or I should say it increases, the federal influence into what policy happens in the states, whereas there may be things we want to do in our states that our citizens are asking for us to do, but because it touches a program perhaps that we're receiving dollars for from the federal government, we cannot do those things. And so there's a lot more power as we've made that progression away from the dual federalism in the federal government controlling states, and especially a smaller state like Idaho. For every $1 of tax dollars we send to the federal government, we actually receive $1.40. So we are a donee state in a sense. A lot of what we do here, because of our low population, is funded by other states, which may be seen as an inequity. But those are things that we talk about. But those dollars coming into our state are extremely important. So it drives a lot of our policy, or at least it makes it very difficult for us as a state in a union to make policy that affects just our state, or is counter perhaps to what the federal government's policy is doing. And so that's a difficulty in that federalist system the way we have it. And we see similar difficulties also in the state itself when the state is setting policy, but then we have counties and cities that are somewhat autonomous as well in a federalist way, and they have similar complaints. So it's something we need to be aware of in setting policy as state legislators. With the party system here in Idaho, I'm just, again, trying to touch upon some of the things that Professor Sonnicksen said, but Idaho is primarily a Republican state. I think both parties have grown a bit more polarized. I attribute that a little bit to somewhat of the technological advances and people having their information siloed now and not being so willing to hear what other people want to say. But as it's grown more polarized, those discussions have become more difficult. Within Idaho, there are, and I'll use this term, shades of republicanism, where it seems because we don't have a large minority party to have discussions with and try to coordinate with, it then falls to, we tend to battle within ourselves here within the party, which can be detrimental in that sense as well. And I think we're seeing that up on the federal level as that goes up. Moving forward, it's going, you know, there's a lot of talk in states now, in particular Republican states, that we need to push back a little bit on the federal government. And my position is not that this is solely because of a new administration, because we saw some of the policies that step outside of the constitutional bounds have been happening for many years with executive orders, governing or legislating, if you will, through the executive branch, not what was intended with the multiple senators and representatives there from varying states bringing their perspectives and hashing it out in a deliberative process. So the fact that we're starting to become a little bit governed more centralized and through the presidency is something that is a large topic of conversation. I think in many states, we saw similar things happening under President Trump, where some of the states that were more blue, if you will, were just refusing to enforce some federal policy, going in ways that they thought was appropriate, where there was immigration or recreational drug use and different things like that. They started to affect that just in a matter of doing it, not necessarily making it policy, but that relationship is a little bit different, I think, under a new administration with President Biden at this point, that there may be more activity in enforcing it where under Trump there wasn't, but trying to reestablish those bright lines of federalism where the federal government isn't exceeding its bounds of the Constitution. I believe the Constitution hems them in appropriately, and there have been changes over the years, but I would think it would be detrimental to be looking to have more power within the presidency so that they can move faster. We're supposed to be deliberative and using that legislative process, not moving in a fast, reactive way so that it benefits everybody in the nation. That process of debate, of making sure the minority voice is heard, of why we have elected representation from specific areas that will reflect those specific areas in a larger body. That's, I think, very important to the system of federalism, that we can make sure that nobody is running over anybody, although we do have the majoritarian part of it as well, and we will see things happen, I'm sure, much more quickly at this point, at least in the next 2 years, because the Democrats hold both the House and Senate and the presidency. That's concern for some of us who don't necessarily agree with those policies. How do we react appropriately as a state? How do we embolden what federalism is? in doing that. And what we point to often as our 10th Amendment, which says the federal government is bound by what's enumerated in the Constitution. Anything that steps outside of it is left up to the states or the people themselves, which I interpret to be the smaller political subdivisions within the state. That's being pressed again, meaning that relationship. And it was pressed under Trump as well. And so, but that is that push and pull of our system, I think, that keeps it, it does keep it somewhat fresh in the sense that there's always an attempt to force one's political will. And when you have the majority, it moves in that direction. But at the same time, there's the ability for the minority to resist that push in order to promote its interests so that it is not taken advantage of in that system. Some of these problems, not just the rise of the presidency, but a lot on the national level, as far as policymaking, has been deferred to our federal court system as well, which was never intended, but legislators have become a little lax in their duties and not wanting to make decisions, perhaps, as this become more of a popularity contest on the federal level, and they aren't making the decisions they want to and leaving it up to the courts to make those decisions. And that's something that steps outside of our original constitutional bounds as well. And those ramifications are felt throughout the states too. And trying to reestablish that, that's another facet of what I think we're going to be heading to. I'm hopeful, optimistic, I should say, that this isn't something that will start to break this country apart. Unfortunately, there's talk about that on the fringes of both sides, but that's not the solution, in my opinion. I think we have a strong foundation that we need to get back to. And as we stepped a little bit away from those moorings of the original intent of what our founders were, we need to get back to that, because I do think it is the opportunity for everybody's concerns to be addressed in going forward. And then you need to accept, because of our democratic aspect of it, that sometimes you don't always win. And then what you do is you work a little harder to try and convince people in that sense. And that is something that goes on within a small state of Idaho, within this body, and then also on the national level. But those big political swings we're seeing, I think, make it a bit harder to affect those changes. The polarization is very real, and I think it only engenders more polarization. And as we continue to govern by executive order and focusing on the presidency and the popularity of that person, it does somewhat water down what our original construction was and what was protecting the individual areas of the states, and then within the states as well. In doing that, I am far more in line with answering questions than I am with lecturing. So I will leave it at that. Hopefully that is an overview a little bit of some of the struggles of what I see as a state legislator and what we have to deal with in regards to the federal government. But I look forward to answering questions, and I will leave it there.
Well, thank you very much to Representative Sage Dickson, but of course also to Professor Jared Sonnicksen for his presentation. It is now my great pleasure to moderate this part of the event, where I and you as our global audience get to ask both of our speakers questions on their remarks and the presentation, but also raise issues that may respond or apply more to their respective countries. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, keep them short and succinct, and refrain from just commenting so we can get through as many questions, or I can throw them at our speakers as we can. And I will just, while you're still thinking, kick off with a first question to Representative Sage Dickson. Professor Sonnicksen has stated in his paper that governing in the United States is especially difficult. And you've outlined some of the difficulties, but as a practitioner, would you agree?
Yes, thank you for that question, Anya. It is difficult, but I believe that's the intent. We did not want to move too quickly, and to not have, it's something I will repeat consistently that I believe strongly, is not to have a minority overrun, to make sure that everybody has their opportunity to have their voice heard. And that's what our representational republic is about in that sense of doing it. So larger issues, as the professor addressed, be it climate change or other large topics that may want to move more quickly on, certainly it's difficult. But I think that's where consensus comes in, so that what is coming out is a true reflection of the entire polity and not just a section of it.
Thank you. To Professor Sonnicksen, Jared, I'd like to pick you up and continue the topic on the shades or the phases you have described. You've mentioned, of course, the dual federalism, cooperative federalism, and coercive federalism we are currently in. Do you think federalism is still developing and evolving, or are we now stuck in this coercive federalism? And what will be the way out?
So first of all, thanks once again, also to Representative Dickson. I thought those were excellent points. And I think an important aspect here, there were many important aspects also from this talk. I completely forgot to talk about the judiciary, and I won't here, but I would like to underline how important that is. To point out, to explain how things have happened. And it's a route that various political actors, parties, different sides take to contest various policies. And I think that plays into where we are now in an interesting combination between sort of this national polarized system that permeates various levels. State, local, and federal level. Because again, it's the same two parties everywhere. You know, I mean, the US has an electoral system that's majoritarian, but so does Canada, as do India, both very large federal democracies. But in different regions, you'll have various two parties competing, whereas in the US, it's the same two. And I think that underlines sort of, on the one hand, this integration of both parties, which from a representative democratic standpoint is not a bad thing. I mean, you know more now compared in the 1950s and 60s which party you're voting for. And Representative Dickson pointed out correctly, they're still both, for their parts, diverse, Republicans and Democrats, but they're much more coherent as parties than they used to be a few decades ago. But the interesting thing is they're so consolidated across the political system. At the same time, the political system remains highly decentralized. And I thought that was a good point too, not only between federal and states, but many states, especially large ones like Idaho, are quite decentralized within themselves too. So you have this an interesting combination between a quite coherent, nationalized political party competition dynamic, almost representative, or almost reminding us of the dynamics of government versus opposition in parliamentary systems. But those are terms they don't use in the US because it's not a parliamentary system. There's no opposition. Minority parties are not the opposition. They still have to govern with, because of how diverse, diffuse the powers are dispersed. So long story short, where are we? We're at an interesting point where things can take different directions. I would point out with the coercive federalism, I think not only from a political standpoint, I think very well from also a political science perspective too, you know, without saying what my policy preference is. Although obviously I do have that, and I'm actually an American citizen still, although I've been in Germany for 20 years. But from a more neutral political standpoint, science standpoint, we could say coercive federalism is a problem because it doesn't really have the constitutional legitimacy to have this executive overstretch through executive de facto legislative or lawmaking by trying to tie the hands of states by funding or the presidents using the ability they have, or to try to take the scope they have in implementing laws and twisting them by adding strings to the financing states should get. So they're essentially taking on a lawmaking role. It's understandable because of the dynamics of the president trying to get their policies pushed through, but it's problematic for a number of reasons. So yeah, it's difficult to capture under one banner what we have in American federal democracy, other than which I would say we have this sort of quite fragmented system. That could be a good thing, depending on how things develop going further. Yeah, I wouldn't, but I'll stop at that point. I think I've talked too much again.
I would like to come back to the Constitution, which we've already mentioned, and both of you have talked about. You, Jared, said the ancient Constitution is maybe not fit for purpose anymore. Sage, you said, well, once the federal government started to move in, it was difficult to work with that Constitution. But despite the misgivings about maybe the complexity and fragmentation caused by the federalist system, the acceptance and pride in the federalist system is still quite strong. And I would like to hear from both of you where you think this is coming from. So, for example, in Germany, we have what is called constitutional patronism. The legitimacy and the acceptance of the federal system being laid down in its constitution. Of course, the US Constitution does not mention federalism or a federalist system. So my question maybe to you first, Sage, where do you think the legitimacy of the federalist principle that derives from in the United States?
I believe it's written into the Constitution, even though it doesn't specifically mention it. And that principle and the separation of powers clearly aligns that all together. And I believe it's still a very strong principle within the states. As far as it being a bit malleable, I mean, we have those methods within the Constitution, and there's a lot of talk. I'm sure Professor Sonnicksen's aware of the talk of another constitutional convention in order to make some alterations to that across the political spectrum, both left and right, wanting to make some changes to remedy some of the issues that we've got away from with its original intent in some cases, or maybe to remove things that are considered restrictive in other cases in doing that. So as far as the federalism is concerned, I think it is inherent in the document, even though it may not specifically use those words, but that is how we were structured originally to do that. Or to govern ourselves, I apologize.
And maybe to you, Jared, also as an added question, because in previous seminars, we've discussed the need for federalizing countries or new federalist countries to clearly define the divisions of power, and maybe the need to write that in the Constitution. Coming back to Germany, that is a fairly modern constitution when you think about it. So would you agree that young or nascent federalist systems should really set out clearly in their constitution which powers or competences should be delegated or devolved?
Yeah, I think that's an also very important question. So looking at the US Constitution, and I'd like to pick up another thing that Sage Dickson said. Excellent point to remind us of is the 10th Amendment of the US Constitution that reserves powers to the states or the people, as he pointed out. And people can like that or dislike that, but that's what the Constitution has set up. And so I think part of the challenge is, and I use the word ancient not as an original, it's from a I forgot to put that in my references. That's something that Samuel Huntington, the late Samuel Huntington, in an essay in the 1960s already referred to, that the U.S. Constitution is simply old, and that has its advantage, but also disadvantages, combined with its difficulty in amendments. So I think a problem in the U.S. case is certainly whether you want the federal government to do more or the states or less. It's written at a time where a lot of the things that governments simply do today couldn't be in there. You know, I mean, there's just one concrete point. The armed forces are a matter of the federal government, more or less, but there's the militias at the state levels. There's no mention of an air force because flight was impossible in the 18th century. But part of the flexibility of the U.S. Constitution is to not overly do it with the exact wording, but to take the spirit of the Constitution, what was meant, what should be appropriate, and so on and so forth. But then we get into a trap in the US case with people who take the literal wording. Should we take the original intent? Sage Dickson emphasize the intent. So that's a little more open to interpretation and adaptation to current challenges than a strict wording of the Constitution. And there's varied interpretations. And then you have people say, you should read into the Constitution the principles that apply today and go even further. So there's a lot of debate there. On the other hand, now what should new federations do? Should they go full force, fully enumerate every single policy area that needs to be covered? But then you make an overly rigid constitution and you invite all kinds of conflicts perhaps too, and less adaptability. So I think you have to strike a balance. The US case is might be a bit extreme on the flexibility case or the openness case because it has been changed so few times. And that makes it easy. That invites more contestation when the federal government tries to do new things that aren't in the Constitution, and they can't be there because we have words inherited from, as good as they are, but they're inherited from an 18th century context. And that's oftentimes very, very difficult. At the same time, you want to avoid being overly rigid. And so I would say, yeah, to strike a balance. Now that's not very binding, and I hope it could be more helpful, but that would at least as an orientation, a compass going further, especially for new federations, to strike a balance between specificity but also openness to interpretation.
A question from the audience to Sage Dickson. The state representative has suggested that the US system is laudable because it doesn't allow majorities to steamroll minorities, but relies on consensus. But doesn't that just let whatever is the status quo steamroll even large majorities that want change after the manner of John C. Calhoun?
Certainly a problem. I think in saying that, my intent and impression is the deliberation and debate that ensues in not ignoring the voice of a minority in the federal system and with elected representation in doing that. Not that the minority won't still be overcome easily. I will use my state as an example. We, in our House of Representatives, have 70 members, only 12 of which are of the Democrat Party. So we have 58 members of the Republican Party, and we could essentially ignore whatever they had to say in that case. There's very little opportunity for them to make any policy changes. But nonetheless, they are there representing their districts, providing that voice for the people that elected them. So that comes out, and they can attempt to persuade us as well they do. And that was my point in saying that you will still have that issue with a majority being able to easily overcome, but at least there's opportunity to be heard and to persuade and engage in debate on those issues in that sense.
And could I just have a quick follow-up question? We often talk about the political deadlock, especially in the federal Congress. And given your very large majority in the House of Representatives in Idaho, that sounds like there's not really a chance for deadlock. But you spoke about the different shades of the Republicans in your House. So do you still see deadlock in other forums, or what are the most contested issues then?
Certainly we do, and it is usually between both houses and then with the executive branch, and that's where a lot of our deadlock develops, not necessarily within separate parties, and sometimes within the party, but there is, well, not a clear majority within the Republican Party, but those discussions happen, and sometimes they're able to bring in the Democrats. That's part of the political strategy. If you have a minority within the Republican Party, they can reach out to the Democrat and party and bring them over and get enough votes to stall something, or perhaps not have a bill pass or have one pass that they were interested in. So we still see that, but not where you would see it necessarily in a state, maybe, gosh, I'm trying to think, it has a more devised balance or an equal balance between the two parties, where they will be having to debate more of those issues, and smaller amounts of people can be persuaded. But so ours mainly comes between the House and the Senate, and then more frequently the past few years between the governor and the legislature.
But no shutdowns in Idaho?
No shutdowns in Idaho, no.
Another question from the audience, maybe we'll start with you, Jared, this time. Democracy is backsliding in several countries. Is federalism and power sharing part of the problem or part of the solution?
Okay, I guess it depends on which country we're looking at. You can see cases of both, where power sharing arrangements or a large number of veto players or having institutions that can block the system over time can be a source of increasing distrust or frustration with the system. I mean, on the one hand, whether federalism or not, democratic government is not just about participation. That's the major part of it: equality, freedom, and so on and so forth, and participation. But government also has to produce some results to get support. And so with governance getting so complicated in a debordering world, and shifts of powers to other organizations and so on and forth, and even national governments feeling their hands tied. So these complexities can lead to frustrations at different government levels that might encourage this desire for having a more authoritarian type government that gets things done, pushes things through, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we see many cases where federalism can serve as also a check itself. I mean, that's the US case. Whether one supported a Democratic president in the past years or a Republican or now under Trump, federalism works as itself as a form of separation of powers and checks and balances. It allows also, at the same time, the positive side, as Sage Dickson emphasized, these laboratories of democracy, spaces and places for things to be expanded and done on their own, and to work as a safeguard, not only against expansion of power from the national level, but also policy failures at a higher level. So federalism provides also a safeguard to that extent. And I think the US case is also in that regard a positive example, where it works as a division of powers. And I think that's sort of the spirit from the outset also in the German case. I mean, that's the reestablishment of federalism after the Second World War. In addition to having a constitution and parliamentary democracy, federalism played, I would say, a quite significant role in the stabilization of the political system.
Sage, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that was a very cogent response, so I won't try and taint it with my own.
Right, well, we'll move on to a more political question then from the audience. Dr. Sonnicksen mentioned the radicalization of the Republican Party. What is the path to de-radicalization for the Republican Party?
Professor.
Yeah.
Well, I can try. If that was directed at me, I'm not sure. And
I was going to give you 2 minutes to think about that, but okay. Go on.
Well, to use a big fancy term, I think it's a bit of an epistemological problem with the information that people are receiving and how knowledge is being gained and disseminated. And I spoke to that a little bit earlier with a lot of our knowledge is siloed now due to the internet and how algorithms decide what they want you to see. And as I've ruminated on that a little bit, I think that's a large problem, and people aren't really seeking out opposing sides. So that increases that polarization that Professor Sonnicksen was speaking of in that sense. So the more we can encourage debate and giving more information, something I have to battle a lot with my constituents is they'll get something that's a half truth or just misinformation, and then they start asking me why I'm not doing something that hasn't really even occurred yet, or they don't know how I truly feel about that issue. And it's a matter of time. We've become very busy people, and there's a lot to go do and occupy our time with. So it's hard to gather the appropriate information and digest that information and come to a firm conclusion that has as much fact as you can gather. So I think that is inherent in both parties at this point, not just the Republican Party. And I think that's a little bit of what we battle with, the polarization, and media certainly doesn't help in any of that.
Jared, any recommendations on what Sage's party should do?
Well, I mean, I didn't mean to put, again, to be political in that sense. I think but we did see, and it's exactly correct that the polarization is in the Democratic Party as well. I would say it's not as, at least in the rhetoric, maybe not as far in parts at national level that we've seen in the Republican Party. And I think this has been a challenge. We saw this under Obama with this Tea Party movement, where a lot of the traditional moderate Republicans were defeated. Although we see this trend coming out of the Democrats, I mean, where some more from the left are defeating establishment Democrats through the primary system, where the people vote for the candidates themselves and not the parties, which is typical most other countries. So that has an institutional invitation sometimes for outside candidates to become the candidate of a party that nobody in the establishment part of the party wanted to have in the first place. And that dynamic is taking place on both sides. But I see it stronger, at least judging by party research on American parties, that's become a stronger challenge so far for the Republican Party on how to deal with a certain wing of the Republican Party. And I think we saw that at play quite strongly under the Trump presidency, and also the turbulences that took place after the election. And that's a dilemma, because at the same time, Trump was very popular, you know, I mean, and so it's for representatives in a representative democracy, you know, they don't represent just their own preferences, but also those of their voters. So it's one thing that I would suggest is out of the box. I do wonder sometimes if both parties and multiple levels of government would have it easier if the US had proportional representation. That would mean a loss of seats for the two major parties, and only major parties in the US, but it might take off some of the pressure of dealing with these various wings in both parties. Some may say that's exactly a good thing, that both the parties have to sort of seek compromise within their parties, and to a large extent. But I do wonder if that would be, given the extent of polarization nowadays, if that might not be helpful for a lot of politics, to have a more proportional system where then third parties have an easier access to gain seats in the Congress or state legislatures, and they don't have to get into one of the two major parties and pull them in the one or the other direction. I don't know if that's the right way. If we have time, I don't know if Representative Dickson would like to respond to that.
I was just going to say, we are running out of time, but I can't not give Sage Dickson the opportunity of sharing his enthusiasm for proportionate voting.
Professor, can you please explain what you mean by that, just so I'm clear before I answer incorrectly? As far as proportional representation, is that what you said?
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind. Okay.
Yeah. So that, so for example, that not every seat in a legislature is voted in a district, but that you have a list, and then you can vote for party A or party B, and then percentage-wise, the seats are distributed then to those parties, and the parties would then have selected their candidate.
Okay. I see some merit in that. I think that'll be a very hard change to make, and I don't know, with my conception of the electoral process here and how it flows, that you may see minorities perhaps getting in as far as a new party or something, but they would be an extreme minority, so it wouldn't change very much. And because we don't have that parliamentary system, there would be little interest in joining with them, or they'd get pulled in one way or another to be with the majority party in that sense. I think Maine has done something similar to that with their electoral system. Some other states have tried to go in that direction, or a ranking system where it may not be strictly along our primary system, strictly along party lines, that they will have ranking in doing that. Not very popular out here in Idaho, at least, in most Western states in doing that. Perhaps on the coastal states would be up for that, but it's curious. It might show more representation, because that's what's important to me, as you've heard, is accurate representation in doing that. But those parties are moving, and people being able to articulate well and gain a consensus should be able to get in, even if they're within a party. And to your point, the Tea Party was able to come into the Republican Party and start to articulate what their perspectives were and convince people that they were a better candidate for that district than what we would term moderate ones in that sense. So I think it's in there a little bit without having to go to the proportional representation.
So as we're already way over an hour, I think you're going to get away with not answering whether Trump will stand or not. I'm afraid we really have to conclude the session now, because while some of you may have just woken up, others, it's late for others and it's bedtime for others. Our next seminar will take place on the 10th of March at the usual time. We will return to the topic of federalism and the COVID-19 pandemic, because no, it has not gone away. And we'll hear from another practitioner, State Minister and Head of Bavaria's State Chancellery, Florian Herrmann, who will talk about how German federalism has coped with the pandemic, and also whether it has changed German federalism or the way it works. So join us then, tell your colleagues and friends about it. And I should also mention that all of our sessions, this one and previous sessions, will shortly be available on our website, and you can watch some of them on YouTube as well. This now leaves me to just thank Professor Jared Sonnicksen for his presentation, and Representative Sage Dickson for getting up so early, first of all, and sharing some practical insights into US federalism. And of course, for answering all those questions I threw at both of them. Many thanks to all of you watching and participating today. We'd be grateful if you could just click in the short survey that'll pop up now, and then leave the Zoom. And depending on where you are, I now wish you a good night, good afternoon, or a good morning. Have a good day, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much.